All right, let's go ahead and hop back in. Woo. Ugh. Okay. All right. Talking about our psychosexual stages of development. Woohoo. No, okay, we're fine. Okay, so there are 5 of these. So Freud was of the mind that kids developed at different fixations at different times. Okay. And that there was a zone of conflict called neurogynous zone. Let's talk about what that means in a minute. Oh, having my book would have been good. But we will talk about, let me just use the chart. There's a chart over here that lays all this stuff out. That's very useful. It's also in your book. We'll refer back to that in a bit. That's on what, 18? Okay, cool. So there are 5 stages. The way that I remember this is only a penguin likes grapes. Does it make any sense? No, but it is effective in terms of learning these things. So all of these have an age that they correspond to, a zone that they correspond to, and then a fixation behavior that they correspond to. And so you probably need to remember all of them because there's like 15 to 20 bits of information that come from this one idea. Okay, yeah, all children experience this as they mature into adulthood, according to Freud. Okay, so it starts with the oral phase. So this is as soon as you're born. So you like 18 months ish. It's when this ends. So the erogenous zone is the mouth. So that is the place where the conflict is taking place. And the conflict centers on weaning. Okay, so learning how to use these teeth that you are developing. Okay, so what behaviors might we see in an adult who was fixated in the oral stage? So if you don't resolve these conflicts in these various stages, there are behaviors that could present themselves as an adult. Like I said, Freud was all about the unconscious feeding into the conscious. So just use oral phase as an example. So you can see here at the top, you can see the oral phase, the age at which it occurs, the erogenous zone, which is the mouth in this case. Focus is sucking, chewing, and gumming. So learning how to chew. The type of conflict is weaning. And then the behaviors, the conscious behaviors that can result from this unconscious lack of resolution in this phase would be smoking, drinking, nail biting, and excessive talking. So you can see all of these behaviors center around the mouth. It's an oral fixation. Okay, and pretty much all of these phases are going to follow that pattern. Okay, the next stage is the anal stage. Yeah, I said anal. Roughly 18 months to 3 years old-ish is when this happens. The erogenous zone is the anus. So the conflict centers on toilet training. So when you are learning to go potty, not you. So when they are learning how to control their bodily functions. So you have this, you can visualize this, probably don't remember this phase of your life, but idea of like controlling versus releasing. And that's basically what the anal stage is all about, learning to either hold on or let go in a manner of speaking. So how caregivers, so parents address this developmental task shapes personality. So this is when we start to get into actual personality traits. And so lack of resolution in this anal phase can result in either being anal expulsive or anal retentive. Okay, so anal retentive might have been something that you've heard before. So if somebody's anal retentive, they're very like detail oriented, very type A, like, are kind of a control freak. Whereas if you're anal expulsive, you're like an agent of chaos. Okay, you don't have a ton of control over your impulses. Just wake up and choose violence every day. Okay, so referring back to our chart, 18 months to 3 years, erogenous zone is the anus. Focus is eliminating or controlling bodily functions. Okay, so either holding on or letting go, because that's what that phase is all about. And then the fixation can go one of two ways: being rule bound or stingy, so that's anal retentive, or chaotic and destructive. So you can kind of see how the focus in the initial stage, so it reflects itself in the conscious behaviors later on. So either when you are trying to hold on to your bodily function or release it, okay, so having control or not having control plays itself forward into these fixated behaviors later on of either having control or not having control. Right. Next is the phallic stage. Phallic means penis. Okay, so ages 3 to 6 years old. That's this is when the superego starts to develop also. So you start to develop a conscience. The erogenous zone is the genitals. Okay, so, and the conflict centers on attraction to the opposite sex parent. Okay, this is when it's going to get real weird. Okay, so just brace yourselves. So we have these two complexes. So the first one, the most famous one, is called the Oedipus complex. If you've never read Oedipus, I'm not going to explain it to you, but it is the attraction a boy feels towards his mother, along with the resentment or envy directed toward his father. And the opposite effect in women is the Electra complex. Okay, same idea. So basically, we're trying to replace the same-sex parent because of an attraction that we have to the opposite sex parent. Both conflicts are resolved through identification, so internalizing the behaviors and just like different traits about them of the same-sex parent. We'll also learn later that this plays itself out in the latest phase by being attracted to people that resemble the opposite sex parent, because we're no longer so focused on ourselves, but we're projecting that outwards onto others. Don't read too much into this. That's probably the best advice I can give you. All this is very theoretical and based on conversations that Freud had with very specific people. So they may have had these issues. That doesn't mean you have these issues. This is just his theory. But the phallic stage, 3 to 6 years, erogenous zone is the genitals, sexual feelings, awareness of self. Now, again, we're talking about somebody who's between 3 and 6 years old. So if you're like, why is this toddler having sexual feelings? I don't know what to tell you because this is just Freud. Type of conflict, self-stimulation. It's pretty, how would we say that? A delicate way of putting that. And then the results of that fixation, promiscuity. So again, if we don't resolve this conflict, promiscuity, fortification, vanity, overdependence, and a focus on a word I'm not going to say in this class with high schoolers. But that is the focus. So we'll say self-satisfaction. How about that? It's a more diplomatic way of saying that. All right. So after the phallic stage, we get to this point called the latency period, which is from 6 to 18, where everything just kind of chills out for a bit, I guess. And you don't have to worry about all this weird sex stuff. There's no erogenous zone or conflict. There's repressed sexual energy. Instead, the focus is on mental, social, and physical development. Well, that part sounds lovely. So all this just kind of chills out until you hit puberty, in which case it revs right back up into the genital stage, which goes from puberty until death. Like that's just the rest of your life. It's the genital stage. So it begins at puberty. You have this sexual reawakening. So you're remembering all that weird sex stuff from the earlier part of your life. The erogenous zone is the genitals, but now it is association with other people rather than yourself. Okay, so slightly different focus there, even though it's a lot of the same energy. And according to Freud, you would often seek out romantic partners who resemble the opposite sex parent. Okay, if you're in a relationship right now, don't read too much into that. Okay, again, this is Freud. This is definitely not something that everybody agrees on, but it's still something that we talk about. Okay, so you can see those two reflected here. Latency period is not that important because really nothing happens. But just remembering when that happens. And so from age 6, the end of the phallic stage, until puberty. And then again, genital stage is by far the longest one because that goes from 18 until you die. So that is sexual reawakening. Result of fixation is inability to thrive in adult activities such as work and love. So once we start interacting with others, we're going to begin to have problems. So there were a lot of people that were kind of in Freud's That's all of Freud's stuff, by the way. So we're going to pivot away from talking about Freud specifically, which is a huge relief for me, because I candidly am just not a huge fan of Freud, which is a relatively common opinion. Why we still teach it in intro psychology courses, I'm not 100% sure. Mostly because he was just important at the earliest phases of psychology. And there are still a lot of psychoanalytical like therapists and researchers, but we'll talk about a few people because pretty immediately, starting with Adler, who was Freud's contemporary, a lot of people were like, yeah, we agree with some of that stuff, but we're mostly going to get rid of all the weird sex stuff that we don't think is that important. Adler was definitely in that category. So according to Adler, humans are not just pleasure seekers, but are conscious and intentional in their behaviors. Okay. So that is rejecting the idea that the id and the unconscious are driving all of our conscious decisions, kind of putting more of the power back in our hands. You'll see this idea specifically picked up by the humanists, who we've already talked about a good bit in this course, but we'll talk about more because they have a lot to say about personality as well. Adler would go on to say, we are motivated by the need to feel superior. This originates in childhood and is a natural response, okay? So you can see down here at the bottom of the slide, talking about Adler in birth order. So this starts, this like superiority, inferiority thing starts in our sibling relationships. Assuming you have one of those, I have one. I'm the oldest. My little sister is 3 years younger than me. We were pretty much constantly trying to outdo each other because according to Adler's theory, like we have this need to feel superior to others, and if we don't, we struggle with this thing called an inferiority complex. Okay, so if you think about like somebody having a chip on their shoulder, that's kind of the idea behind an inferiority complex. Feelings, somebody struggling with those feelings of inferiority. And then Adler was also, again, this is somebody taking some of Freud's ideas and then either extending them out or getting rid of some of them and focusing on other ones. Adler branching out into this sort of newer form of research into birth order. Okay, so his ideas was that depending on where you were born in the family sequence would determine a lot of things about your personality. And I think the next slide is, yeah. Okay, so how true is that? How does birth order affect your personality? So a lot of this comes down to stereotypes or archetypes. Sorry. Okay, so I'm an oldest sibling. Usually the stereotypes about oldest siblings that they're like the go-getters, the golden children, they're ones that have all their stuff together. Is that always true? No, but that is the stereotype. Then you have like your youngest kids who are always going to, people think are spoiled, can get everything they want, can get away with anything because they're the baby, that kind of thing. Again, not necessarily true at our house. And then you have your middle child who, forgotten about because they're in between these two very strong personalities, and a lot of times they turn into a bit of a rebel because they don't, they have to do extravagant things to get the attention away from the oldest sibling or the youngest sibling. So again, these are all largely stereotypes. But what does the research say? So there's some evidence to support these ideas, but there are a lot of confounding variables. So like family size, age gaps between the siblings, gender differences, even just cultural differences from family to family. All of these things can make isolating birth order as a variable very challenging. So doing research at all on this kind of thing is hard. But there's also this like self-fulfilling prophecy question of, have these stereotypes been so ingrained into our society that, as a parent, you would treat an oldest child differently from a middle child, or a middle child differently from a youngest child. We don't know. We don't know if these are just, don't know the chicken or the egg question. We don't know which came first. Also, I don't know if you can hear, but my dog is snoring. Okay, so Another one of these neo-Freudians, that's what this group of people that were like kind of half in, half out on Freud were called, the neo-Freudians. I'm a big fan of the neo-Freudians. I think they were very cool. Because again, a lot of this stuff is valid, but the extent to which Freud brought it out and focused on certain things that I don't think were entirely relevant is the problem, not so much just his specific ideas. Okay, so Carl Jung, another name that you've probably heard of. So analytic psychology de-emphasized biological urges. So he's saying no thank you and all that sex nonsense. Emphasize growth, insight, and balance. Okay, so yeah, we're tiptoeing towards the humanists because you have Freud over here, who is very much like all of your actions are controlled by unconscious processes. Your id basically tells you what to do at all times. You have to listen to it. And then you have the humanists over here who are like, humans have complete self-determination. Everybody's trying to make themselves better at all times. You are the master of your domain. There's nobody can knock you off that pedestal. So there's a lot of space in between those things. And that's kind of where Jung is. So personality made up of ego, personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. So similar terminology to Freud's topographical model, but different ideas. So the personal unconscious, so you have your ego, which is kind of not exactly like Freud's ego. So the ego for Jung would have been more like just the conscious level. But then you have your personal unconscious, which is kind of Freud's preconscious and unconscious ideas just smushed together. So basically anything that isn't happening at a directly conscious level. Then one of the things that Jung is most known for is this idea of a collective unconscious, because there are universal experiences from culture to culture that we all kind of identify with. Okay, so where does it get this? You talk to people from different cultures, you read books and historical accounts from different cultures to kind of pick up on these things, and you kind of see very similar mythology, similar symbolism, things like that. And so we start to form these archetypes. Okay, so these Jungian archetypes is a big thing in psychology. And the example they use here is sort of this BA female heroine. So we have Joan of Arc and then Wonder Woman, sort of the modern version of that archetype. So that is a mythology that comes from a real person, Joan of Arc, but that is from a culture that is very distant to the one that Wonder Woman was dreamed up in, and then even the one that Wonder Woman in canon comes from. And so you have this shared mythology that we all borrow bits and pieces from to create these archetypes. That's all part of your collective unconscious. So if you think Adler, think birth order. If you think Jung, think collective unconscious. And then when we get to Ornay, which is how you say that word, Ornay, emphasize the role of the child caregiver relationship. So that's what we're talking about with Ornay, child caregiver relationship, almost exclusively. And so her big thing, she's a German psychologist. Inadequate parenting can create feelings of helplessness and isolation. Okay, so if you have this failure at this child caregiver relationship level, that can create problems down the road. So again, this is similar to Freud's stages, but instead of it being like very specific things happening at very specific times, you just kind of have this broad, okay, well, if the caregiver relationship doesn't go super well, then these things can happen. Okay, so there's 3 ways that you can deal with this, what's called basic anxiety. So that basic anxiety comes from that failure at that child caregiver relationship. There's 3 things that you can do to sort of resolve this tension. So you can move towards people, you can move away from people, move against people. So you can, create relationships with people that are like-minded and sort of rebuild that trust and closeness that you didn't get in that child caregiver relationship. Or you can move away from people, which, you say, well, I've been on my own, taking care of myself for this long, might as well keep doing it. That would be just sort of this isolationism, becoming an island that's moving away from people. And then you can also move against people. So that's this sort of like dominating other people to try and get the attention and recognition that you may not have gotten from your caregiver. So those are your three potential responses to basic anxiety. So just to recap, Adler, birth order, um, Jung talking about collective unconscious, Horney talking about the child caregiver relationship. All right, so now we are all the way down to our boy Sigmund and his legacy. Okay, so it is a complicated legacy. So psychoanalytic theory, which is Freud's theory, made important contributions to the study of personality. That much is kind of hard to argue, okay, because we're still talking about it 120 years later. But key criticisms, there's a lot of them. Okay, so much of the work is considered unscientific, again, because for something to be like really rigorously scientific, you have to be able to test it, which you can't in the case of like a very subjective method of data collection that was largely based on case studies, because that's not going to be, there's issues with internal and external validity there, but especially with external validity, fails to appreciate the importance of development beyond childhood. Okay, so we talked about how all 5 of those stages are crammed into 18 years. So, the last one, the genital stage, goes from puberty to death. That's a very long time, hopefully. So it kind of ignores the possibility. I mean, I hope I'm not that old, but I hope that I don't just like stop developing now. That 20 years from now I'm a different person. But according to Freud's theory, that like most of the important stuff is already out of the way, and you're just kind of a slave to your desires past puberty, which is kind of a sad way to think about things. A lot of people say that it also overemphasizes the role of sexuality. Don't think that's too hard of an argument to make. Places too much weight on the unconscious. Like I said, a big reason that something like the humanist movement exists was to push back against Freud and even the behaviorists who were like, yeah, you can't do anything about your behavior. You're just basically a robot that is, whose actions are basically governed by past experiences and reactions to those, or by associations and external stimuli. And the humanists were like, no, that's not good. Pretty much a lot of people disagree with Freud's emphasis on the unconscious. And then it is based on a biased, non-representative sample. So again, we talked about how a lot of Freud's clients were already mentally ill, and so that doesn't make them great for actually like taking more general conclusions away from, because again, they are not representative of sort of your everyman. So if you're going to try and apply findings that you get from interviewing someone who's neurodivergent, has schizophrenia or autism spectrum disorder or something like that, is going to be difficult to apply what you learn from that interaction to someone who's neurotypical, because they have different brains and they have different experiences because of the way their brains are wired. So again, non-representative sample, bias because of who he was interviewing and how. All right, so we can, how far do we, yeah, okay, so we'll do the humanists. They're not going to take too long. Okay, so the humanistic, we already talked about them a little bit. So the humanistic perspective. So this is in the 1960s and 70s. So Freud's a lot earlier than that. So Freud is like, I think, turn of the 20th century, which was hard for him. So we'll circle back to Freud for just a second. So Freud was Jewish and he was from Austria. And if you know anything about that part of the world and being Jewish around that time, it become pretty complicated pretty quickly. So that also may have framed a lot of why he was so like negative about things, and why he was so like, well, you're doomed to just repeat your parents' mistakes, and everything about you is already been determined in childhood, because he was sort of doomed to a certain like stage of life because of his religion and his ethnicity. But I'm sorry, kind of a long diatribe, but that was important because it helps you understand Freud a little bit better. But the humanists were like, well, we do have some control over this. So this gained popularity in the 1960s and 70s. So as a direct pushback against the behaviorists like Skinner, Pavlov, all those guys, and the psychoanalytic theory. Oh no, they're missing an O. Let me fix it. There we go. Okay. So according to them, people are innately good and in control of their destinies, and then the positive aspects of human nature drive personality development. So instead of childhood trauma or those psychosexual stages of development, positive aspects of human nature wanting to improve is going to be the thing that people use to develop themselves. Yeah, I don't care about this. Okay. So our main two figures in humanism, we've talked about them a good bit already. Abraham Maslow, so he came up with the hierarchy of needs. I believe that psychologists should study human creativity, growth, and healthy functioning. So he's interested in self-actualizers, so people who are trying to get to the absolute top of their game. So we talked about Freud and how he used a non-representative sample that would be very difficult to sort of generalize from. Maslow did the same thing, just with people that weren't mentally ill. He was more interested in people who were high achievers. But again, not everybody's like that. Not everybody has the same kind of level of priorities. So also a flawed way of looking at things. Carl Rogers, who was sort of an American contemporary of Maslow's, believed in this client-centered therapy. And this innate urge to move towards situations and people that will help us and to push ourselves away from people and situations that won't. Always moving towards an ideal self. We have this unconditional positive regard about who we are and where we're going. That's Rogers. So the appraisal of humanistic theory strengths, just generally less negative view of human nature, and less dour, less like, there's nothing you can do about your behavior. Positive psychology draws a lot from it. And then limitations are that it is also subjective, very difficult to experiment with, and that constant praising can be counterproductive. An example they use here is Gloria and her son from Modern Family. Okay, so that was a very quick survey of the humanists. We'll come back to them more next time, but we'll finish chapter 10 next time. So we have that assignment due Sunday. Again, if you have any questions about the test, please email me. We'll get those figured out, I promise. Like I said, there's not a ton that I can do about them at this point, but we'll just keep trying until we get it right. So second part of chapter 10 next time. We'll do a Kahoot to review the first part, and then we will talk about your fourth assignment a little bit and review that, which is due Sunday. I just opened it up so you can look at the instructions again. Us reviewing it is also at the very beginning of this lecture, which I will post on the YouTube page. But until then, I will see you guys next time. Have a great Wednesday. Have a great rest of your week. Bye.